Hello, everyone, and welcome to our lecture on beginnings of nationalism. And this is part of section 5.2 in the AP World History Modern curriculum. Now, in this lecture, we're not going to dive too deeply into a lot of the nationalistic movements. We're just going to kind of touch on some. And it may seem kind of a little disjointed and all over the place because we're going to look at some events that happened in the late 1700s to some that happened in the latter half of the 1800s. And again, this is just to kind of introduce you guys to the ideas and beginnings of nationalism. And matter of fact, we might even come back and do some of these, do more on some of these events in greater detail and further parts of Unit 5, but more like we'll even take a look at some more of the stuff in the early parts of Unit 6. So this is kind of just, like I said, an introduction. So let's get started and talk about some of the earlier nationalistic movements that were mixed in with the Age of Revolution. All right. So first off, you have to have an understanding what nationalism means. And nationalism has many different definitions, but really it's an appreciation of belonging to one's country and a commitment to serve or protect or try to work and benefit it on behalf of that nation or country in some way. And there are several positives to this stance. One, it promises unity among a group of people. It does empower people to work on a common ground for a common good, generally speaking. And only from a nation standpoint, it does offer the idea for possibility for potential allies or friendly competitors, whether you're looking at it in terms of, political, economic, or even social and cultural connections. The negatives is that it does threaten masses to serve the state in the kind of the grandiose ideas of nationalism. And then ultimately the big negative, and this has played itself out really throughout history, but more commonly here with the advent of this term, it turns one nation against each other, which leads ultimately to warfare. And when we talk more about nationalism later on in this course, specifically with the World Wars, which we'll probably come back and, like I said, breach some of these topics again in more detail, we're going to see some of the greatest wars we've ever seen in human history. And nationalism is going to play a huge role in that. So the first goal of nationalism is to create a modern independent nation where none really existed before, but to bring the common people together. So let's talk about some examples of nationalism here that are going to exist throughout the latter part of the 1700s and early to mid part of the 1800s. So with the Ottoman Empire, we see this anti-imperial nationalist movement or even revolts actually becoming common throughout Western Europe. And when those revolts and stuff become common throughout Western Europe, they spread to Central and then Eastern Europe, which is getting into the doorstep of the western part of the Ottoman Empire. And what this happens is this leads to not only a loss of support and funding into the Ottoman Empire from Western European countries like France, but it means that they're going to lose territory because of nationalistic movements or even because of imperial expansion by Russia and so forth. So these revolts in Europe, particularly for the sake of talking about the Ottoman Empire in Greece, leads to the loss of most of their territories in Europe. But you're also going to see breakaways in the 1700s and 1800s from the Ottoman Empire in North Africa and other parts of Southwest Asia, specifically in Saudi Arabia, and then in Egypt with Muhammad Ali taking control there, and then if you even go farther westward, the French taking control of Algeria. Now, one of the systems that kind of hurts the Ottoman Empire as we move through history is the millet system. Originally, it did help them a lot, but because this system was in place, we actually see it open the door for the Western Europeans to enter into Ottoman politics, which ultimately is one of the reasons why, when you add in revolts and so forth, that actually helps split them up and weaken their power. And basically, it leads the Ottoman Empire to be open for exploit whether it's from within or from the outside. And they get labeled the sick man of Europe. All right, so what the Ottoman Empire tries to do in the mid to latter half of the 1800s is they try to issue reforms. These reforms are called the Tanzimat reforms, with the goal of bringing the empire up to closer standards with Western Europe and basically modernizing it. But ultimately it fails, and because the reforms are actually limited. There's just too much for them to do. And this reversal creates a significant group called the Young Turks. And the Young Turks are going to be exiled, but ultimately will gain power in the years just before World War I. But it brings a threat to the old order, and it shows that further an empire that is systematically falling apart, and it has been for centuries. All right, so let's talk more about kind of these tensions, and this is a little bit more kind of linking you guys more forward to the idea of imperialism as well as obviously nationalism. But the Crimean War is ultimately what's going to really truly reveal the weaknesses of the Ottoman Empire and lead to these different movements of nationalism that are going to take off specifically in the Balkans. And like I said, we'll talk more about this specifically in these nationalistic movements when we get to World War I. But ultimately what happens in the Crimean War is the Russians want to take Ottoman territory to the Danube River. So kind of fully take more area from them in Europe. And what happens is France, Britain, and then eventually Sardinia and Piedmont, an Italian state, come to the aid of the Ottomans, and they help the Ottomans win a victory in the Crimean War. And the Russians are forced to abandon all lands they do take. Now, eventually what's going to happen is a couple of decades down the line, the Russians are going to attack. And they'll ultimately actually take back some land and take some land from the Ottoman Empire. And specifically, you can see on screen in 1877, this does happen again. The British actually do threaten counterattacks and blockades against the Russians. It leads to a conference. But the tensions are really high. And the reason why this is important, and again, is something that we'll talk about later, is because this is creating and helping create that powder keg of tension between not only the Russians, the Ottomans, the British, and these other European powers, but also these smaller groups as well from a nationalistic standpoint that are going to create this powder keg, like I said, that's going to lead to a larger war that's going to happen in 1914. And that war itself is World War I. All right, so now we're going to talk about Italy and Germany. So Italy and Germany, really quick, we'll do more with these guys later. So what happens after Napoleon is ended and his rules ended is the European powers come to a conference, and it's called the Congress of Vienna. And at this Congress, they set up the borders of Europe, and they set limitations to help prevent warfare and then also limit national movements so that you don't cause problems. And the idea is to unify Europe and unify Europe from a standpoint that they can work together. And you start seeing people put together based on common languages and seeing clearly demarcated geographical borders. Now, for the most part, this is going to work specifically in Western and Central Europe. But as we see later, and we've actually kind of already talked a little bit about too, in Eastern Europe, this is going to be a problem. And it'll eventually become a problem in like the Austrian-Hungarian Empire and so forth as well. But specifically with Italy and Germany, Italy, we start to see Italy grow and become the modern state that it is during this period because of nationalism. And they do this through a series of alliances as well as economic deals. But specifically, there's going to be warfare that's going to be used to organize Italy. And you can see here the main figure of the Italian Revolution or Wars of Unification is this man here, Giuseppe Garibaldi. And then in Germany, we're going to see one really strong man, Otto von Bismarck, the man at the bottom of the screen. He's going to work very closely with the German king, King William I or Wilhelm I, to organize Germany into the modern state that it is. Because remember, Germany is a collection of states just like Italy. One of the things that does help is the setting up of a customs union, the Zollverein, which helps us to establish a trade connection or a more cohesive trade unification, which if money's flowing, it makes it easier for people to come together. And then ultimately what Bismarck uses is he uses a policy of blood and iron, which basically warfare and strong-willed politics and production to bring the country together and establish nationhood. And they're going to establish nationhood through victory in two wars, one with Austria in 1866, and then most importantly, their victory in the Franco-Prussian War over France in 1871, which spawns the modern nation of Germany that we know today. All right, here you guys can see Italy itself. Okay, you can see it's a collection of kingdoms, and then ultimately they're able to put together in a period of about 12 years most of what we would consider the modern nation state of Italy through these wars of unification and annexation of territories. Here's Germany. So you can see the unification of Germany through those two wars like I talked about with Austria and France. And you can see the mix-up of the various states, East and West Prussia, Brandenburg, Hanover, and so forth. There's many different ones, and they came together. All right, just a couple more here. Next movement is more of a movement that we'll talk a little bit about later and when they actually gain their own state, but it's the movement of Zionism, and this is a really important nationalistic movement, and it's a movement to recreate the Jewish homeland, because as you guys remember, the Jews have been thrown out of the Holy Land for centuries, and they've settled in diaspora across Europe and across other parts of the world. So as these nationalistic movements are pushing up during this period, this really takes hold in Europe with the Jewish communities, and we see that this kind of progresses throughout the century. But what ends up happening is that even though it's a strong movement, there's actually a strong pushback. Just like we've seen in any part in history with the Jews, there's always a strong persecution against them for a variety of reasons that really are unfounded. But you see an increased persecution and fierce anti-Jewish Semitism that is pushing the Jews out of Europe. And it actually, in a way, is helping their movement of creating a Jewish homeland for them and getting them to return home. But again, it's not a perfect situation, and it's not always a situation that's very peaceful. And one of the most important examples of this kind of persecution against Jews during this period is the Dreyfus Affair, which involved a French officer or an officer in the French army. And we'll look a little bit more at this later on in the class. I just wanted to introduce to you guys, at least understand what the Zionist movement was. And lastly here is we have the disappearance of Poland. And Poland is an example of a combination of imperialism and nationalism. And like I said, we'll talk more about what this nationalistic idea in Poland with World War I, as many of these other things that we've brought up so far. But what happens is in the mid-1700s, Poland starts to get partitioned due to civil war within its own territory, as well as Russian gains on its eastern boundaries. And then when that happens, you also have the two other powers in the region, the Prussian Empire and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, looking at it and seeing that they have a weaker state that they can kind of start to piece off of and take pieces of land. So between 1772 and 1791, what happens is Poland is split up in these agreements by Austria, Prussia, and Russia. You can see on the map there what ultimately ends up happening to Russia or to Poland over this period is these three powers start taking little pieces and eventually becomes bigger and bigger chunks. And the Poles revolt against this. Their revolutionary actions are crushed, the biggest one being under Thaddeus Kosciuszko, an important key figure actually in the American Revolution in helping us. But those are crushed. And Poland, the result is Poland gets erased from the map. And what happens during this period of 1795 to 1918 is these Poles are split up between three different empires. They fight for their nationalistic ideas and sometimes bloody revolutions in the middle of the 1800s to even creating their own systems of government or own movements, whether it's against the actual state they're in or working in conjunction with the state they're in, or working to kind of carve out their own sovereignty within the armies and economic systems of those empires. And ultimately what will happen is they will actually gain that freedom if only for a short time, at the end of World War I. All right, guys, that's all I have for you. Hope you learned a lot. I know this was a kind of a lecture that's all over the place, but again, it's just an introduction to the kind of the nationalistic movements that we'll see moving forward in this century. We'll talk a little bit more about with World War I, and just kind of help you give it an introduction. All right, have a good one.